A lot of the time, the kind of sentences that syntacticians like me look at are long and complex. But today, I want to talk a little bit about some sentences that look very short and simple, and argue that nevertheless, they show some surprising properties that can help us, we hope, understand a bit more about how linguistic systems work. If we want to express a proposition that is basically something that can be either true or false, the typical way to do this is in a clause, which corresponds roughly to a sentence. So something like, Amanda sleeps well, or Bruno loves sushi. And a classic way of thinking about these clauses is that you can divide them into a subject, so that would be Amanda or Bruno, and a predicate, so that would be sleeps well or loves sushi. And the typical word class that's associated with being a predicate is a verb, so loves and sleeps. But it's not only verbs that can be predicates. Another word class that can very frequently appear as a predicate is that of adjectives. So alongside a sentence like Carmen lies, you can also have a sentence like Carmen is dishonest. Or you could have a sentence like some fish luminesce, but you could also have some fish are luminous, or some fish are luminescent. So lie is a verb, but dishonest is an adjective. Luminesce is a verb, but luminous and luminescent are adjectives. Now, you could perfectly well object that, yeah, those are adjectives, but alongside the adjectives, there's always some form of be, and be is a verb. And that's certainly true. Be is a kind of verb in English, and you can tell because it exhibits some typical behaviors of English verbs. So one typical behavior of English verbs is that they can express tense. So you can say Carmen lies or Carmen lied. So present tense versus past tense, and that's signaled by the morphology on the verb. And in the same way, you can say Carmen is dishonest or Carmen was dishonest. So be changes its form depending on the tense. It's an irregular change because be is a very irregular verb, but the same thing is basically going on. So that's a typical verb behavior that you're seeing for be. Another typical verb behavior is that a verb agrees with the subject, and you see that for be as well. So you can say something like, Donald sleeps, but these children sleep. In the same way, you would say Donald is asleep, but these children are asleep. So again, the verb be is changing its form. It's agreeing with the subject of the sentence. So be is certainly a verb. Nevertheless, if we look at the meaning of these sentences, like some fish are luminous versus some fish luminesce, from the point of view of the meaning, it seems that pretty much all of the meaning, apart from the tense, that's expressed by the verb where that occurs, is expressed by the adjective where that occurs. Be is contributing nothing to the meaning. So in that sense, it seems like what corresponds to the verb is really the adjective, that the adjective is the head of the predicate. And that impression is also supported by the fact that in certain circumstances, we can express the same meaning, the same proposition, with an adjective as the predicate without be occurring at all. Now, in English, that possibility is really only possible in embedded clauses. If we look at slightly more complex sentences than we've been considering so far, we can get things like, they consider that Eleanor is exciting. So there's a more complex sentence that's got two clauses, one embedded inside the other. The clause that Eleanor is exciting is embedded inside the clause headed by consider. So now we've got the proposition that Eleanor is exciting. It's got an adjective and it's got the verb be. But we could also say, they consider Eleanor exciting. And that seems to express just the same meaning. So there we've got a much more reduced clause which just has the subject Eleanor and the predicate, the adjective, exciting. And that seems to be enough. These clauses that don't have any verbal element in them at all are typically called small clauses. In English, they're only possible when they're somehow embedded. But in many other languages, that's how you express a proposition containing an adjective, in the present tense at least, even when it's not embedded. So if you want to say the equivalent of Eleanor is exciting in a number of languages, including Hebrew and Arabic, you would have just the noun phrase Eleanor and then the adjective. You wouldn't need to use the verb be at all. Those are adjectives then acting as predicates. But it's not only adjectives. And one other really interesting case is that noun phrases can also act as predicates. Now, nouns are typically thought of as being associated with referring to objects. Nouns like shoe or chef, of referring to objects or to individuals. And they certainly can do that. But it turns out they can also head predicates in just the same way as adjectives, as we've seen. So you can say something like, that object over there is a shoe, or I consider that object over there a shoe. So a shoe is behaving like a predicate. Or Eleanor is a wonderful chef. I consider Eleanor a wonderful chef. Chef is a noun, and a wonderful chef is a noun phrase. So there you've got noun phrases that are behaving just like predicates, that are predicates. These noun phrases are indefinite. They've got the indefinite article a in them. But even definite noun phrases can act as predicates. So I can also say, that shoe on the left is the only shoe worth buying. Or I consider that shoe on the left the only shoe worth buying. Equally, Eleanor is the best chef in town, or everyone considers Eleanor the best chef in town. So even definite noun phrases can act as predicates. That then sets up a situation where in these copular clauses, these clauses where you've got a non-verbal predicate, that both the predicate and the subject could be definite noun phrases. And indeed, we find such cases. And where we do, what we often find is that the order can vary. So I can say both Eleanor is the best chef in town and the best chef in town is Eleanor. That variation in order that you get, though, seems to depend partly on the presence of be. So if we go back to these small clauses, what you typically find is even in the case where you've got two noun phrases, the subject and the predicate, when you have be, you might be able to get both orders. But in the small clause, typically one order is much better than the other. So it's perfectly natural to say, I consider Eleanor the best chef in town, but I consider the best chef in town, Eleanor, is, for most speakers, much less natural. So that fact about small clauses suggests then that some noun phrases, like perhaps names, like Eleanor, are typically the subjects, and the other noun phrase has to be the predicate. But then when we wind back to these clauses with be, where you can get either order, what are we going to say about sentences like the best chef in town is Eleanor? The noun phrase that looked like it had to be the predicate is the one that's in first position. That order is perfectly natural for English speakers. And first position is a typical position for subjects. So now we've got something which we said looked like a typical predicate occurring in a typical subject position. And that's actually not the only grammatical signal that English is treating the first noun phrase as the subject in some way. As I actually said at the beginning, it's a typical property of subjects that the verb agrees with them. Now, in these sentences, you can't tell what the verb is agreeing with because in all the ones we've looked at so far, the two noun phrases are both singular and they're both ordinary noun phrases which are third person. That is, they don't refer to any participant in the exchange. But it's perfectly possible to set up cases where the two noun phrases differ, either in number, so one is singular and one is plural, or in person, so one is third person and one is first or second person, like I or you. And in these cases, we can see what the verb agrees with, which of the noun phrases controls the agreement. What we see in English is that the typical pattern is that speakers spontaneously make the verb, in this case be, agree with the first noun phrase, the one where the order also suggests it's the subject. So you can have a sentence like, these 3 chapters are the best thing in the book, but the best thing in this book is the first 3 chapters. And that occurs much more frequently than the best thing in this book are the first 3 chapters. Or again, you can have, you are the light of my life, but not you is the light of my life for most speakers. But the light of my life is you, rather than the light of my life are you. So here it looks as though we've got a bit of a tension. On the one hand, the meaning, the semantics, seems to be suggesting that you, or the first 3 chapters, those look like being subjects in some sense, and yet what the verb agrees with and what occurs in the typical subject position is the other noun phrase, which looks in some ways more like a predicate. Sentences like this, where there seems to be a conflict between different subsystems of the language, so between the semantics and the syntax, for example, where these things seem to be in tension, we can get information about how these systems interact, and that can be quite informative about how language works. In recent work that I've been doing with Jutta Hartmann of the Institute for the German Language in Mannheim, we've been looking at how these tensions get resolved in sentences like this in a number of languages related to English. In particular, we've been looking at how speakers resolve these questions of agreement where noun phrases might differ in number and in person. As I've said, in English, speakers are pretty consistent about agreeing with the first noun phrase, although there are some kinds of cases where people's behavior and judgment is more variable. So, for example, if you have a sentence like, all I could see was 2 great staring eyes, people are very frequently also able to say, all I could see were 2 great staring eyes. And when they read those sentences, they don't feel the need to correct them or change them. They seem natural. But cases like that are pretty exceptional in English. Generally speaking, speakers are very consistent in agreeing with the first of the noun phrases, even when it's the second one that seems to have some semantic properties that make it more plausible as a subject. What we found looking at German is that German speakers are also very consistent, but they're consistent in the other direction. So if we have a sentence, the equivalent of something like, my biggest problem is my noisy neighbors, German speakers very consistently will say the equivalent of, my biggest problem are my noisy neighbors, and they will actually reject the kind of agreement that English speakers produce. We've established this both by doing tests where we leave a blank in the sentence for speakers to produce what they would find natural in that context, and also by showing sentences to speakers with the different options and having them tell us if they're natural or not natural, so giving them some kind of rating. Even more interestingly, when we looked at some other Germanic languages, so Icelandic and Faroese and Dutch, we found that there was considerable variation. So speakers were not consistent. So there was both variation between speakers, some speakers choosing much more agreement in one direction and some speakers in another, but also within speakers that given a number of choices or a number of chances to choose agreement, they would sometimes do it one way and sometimes do it another. So it looks as though in some languages the tension that arises between perhaps the semantics and the syntax gets resolved in different ways. And in some cases this tension seems unstable. And in fact, in English, we think that over time, English has changed from having a system more like the German one to the system that we see today. And there's a bit of a relic in this in the prescriptive norm that you occasionally see, where people think that you ought to say not "it is me," but "it is I." That's going partly towards the German system, although actually the original system in English, we think, was more like the modern German system, where really what you get is "it am I." And no one ever suggests now in modern English that you should say that. What we've been looking at in particular in our recent work is not just the effect of number variation, but where the two noun phrases differ in person. It's been something that's been observed particularly in the last few years. People have been documenting differences in syntactic behavior between first and second person noun phrases. So I and we, those are first person, and you, second person. Differences in their syntactic behavior from other noun phrases, which are third person. And one observation about the agreement is that agreement with first and second person is typically more fragile than agreement for number. And we've been investigating this in these cases as well across these different languages. Even in English, we might see a hint of this behavior. I said before that there are some exceptional cases in English where you seem to get agreement with the second noun phrase. So one example of this would be something like, all that mattered to me was the children, having also an alternative where you could say, all that mattered to me were the children. For many speakers, that second version is perfectly natural. But now, what if it's you that mattered to me? All that mattered to me was you. Perfect. All that mattered to me were you. Is that okay for you? Most speakers that I have asked about this find that case much worse. And if that's right, that suggests that what you're seeing in English also is just a shadow of this difference between agreement in number and agreement in person. We can look at this much more systematically in these other languages which have much more agreement morphology than English does. And we find interesting cases of variation that relate to person, but not always. So German, for example, shows no trace of this effect at all. And what we hope is that looking then at these contrasts will show us more about why person works in this way and why agreement for person works differently from agreement in number. So overall, what we're trying to find out in these very simple sentences is a bit more about how linguistic systems resolve conflicts between different subsystems, which generally give you the same result, but sometimes seem to be in conflict with each other. And what we've also been focusing on recently is differences between person and number. These are some of the issues that Jutta Hartmann and I have been investigating in our recent work on the Germanic languages. And some of our results can now be read in the papers that we've been writing, which we invite you to read and to send us your responses to.